BAFTA-nominated and RTS-winning television drama director. I first met Ed on the first series of Poldark, but his other credits include Doctor Who, Houdini and Doyle, The Guilty, Endeavour, Holby City, Casualty, and lots more. And I'm going to leave Ed to kind of give details of his career trajectory, but just in case he doesn't reveal quite how cool he is, I should also say that before he became a director, he was in a band called The Vapors, who had a hit in the 1980s called Turning Japanese, which some of you will remember. And for the students in the audience, you can just Google it in the coffee break. But Ed, it's great to have you here. How did you go from playing guitar in The Vapors to becoming director of Versailles?
I've just had a career of, I do something, I get found out, I move on. That's why I've booked my flight already.
But you didn't go straight into drama, did you? How did you?
No, I had a plan to, I did all the sort of sensible things, and I would have been a proper student like lots of you here, and I was going to go to university, and then it was a long time ago, obviously, and I sort of played the guitar, and I just got to a point where I had a choice between going to study film or my band had a residency at an old club in London called the Marquee. And I was made to choose between the two. And so my sort of attempts to get into the film industry were rudely interrupted by sort of doing a couple of world tours with a pop group, which was you know, it's good fun. And I'd highly recommend it as a sort of gap year project. But then as soon as that came to an end, I was sort of, you know, what I wanted to do was sort of really learn a process and to sort of understand. And I'd worked out when I was about sort of 13 that I was good at two things. One was I could just about get away with playing the guitar, and I was very good at watching TV. So I thought, you know, and I'd done the guitar, so I wanted to go onto the TV. And it was, I mean, seriously, it was at the time when, you know, the first film courses were, you know, that you could do a degree in and study film for the first time. And it sort of brought a lot of disciplines in along the way. So it, you know, for me, it was really, really appealing. And that's what I went to do straight away afterwards. And to cut a short story long, then I ended up as an editor at the BBC. And then the transition from editing to directing was, I was kind of sitting there editing director's material, and I was always, you know, generally sort of nice and unassuming, but I just thought, I'm better than you lot, you know. And a lot of the directors I was working with, I just thought, well, what is it that you do that, or you know, that I don't know? And so that was how that sort of transition happened. And then yeah, and I ended up there's at the time the BBC had a big and vibrant arts department, and that's where I was working. You were thinking this was just going to be 30 seconds, weren't you? No. So I made art and history documentaries. And then there was a sort of fashion round, or there was a sort of interest in, which actually harked back to a sort of a film trend in the 60s, where the BBC had kind of done factual dramas and drama documentaries. You know, there's a really famous instance being the War Game, a film by Peter Watkins from the mid 60s, which is a fantastic imagining, combining. You know, lots of different kind of source material, an imagining of a nuclear attack, and then there was this kind of, you know, the drama documentary idea was kind of reinvigorated round about the sort of turn of the century. That sounds so old, doesn't it? And I got involved in that, and I found that more and more of my work was taking a drama form, really. Is that it?
That's perfect, thank you. I think that gives us a helpful glimpse into actually the variety of careers that people often have in productions, that you don't always just end up doing a single thing, but actually there can be quite a kind of varied background there. I mean, as a historian, I only ever witness the production of period dramas. I only ever see, and usually only 18th century ones, so I have quite a narrow understanding of a kind of production process. And one of the things that I often wonder when I visit a set or work with a production is this the same if it was going to be set on a spaceship, or if it was going to be set in, you know, the modern world? Is the production process and actually the process of developing a drama the same, regardless of how you set it? Or is there something particular with period dramas that are involved in the production process, or how you approach the job as a director when something is set in the past? And the answer might be no, they're completely the same, Hannah, you have no idea.
I think regardless of whether it's set in the past or contemporary, I think most from what I've done, I think most of the process is the same, but with the obvious caveat that when you're working on a piece that's set at some point in the past, you always have the history, and I think as so much of what you do and so much of what you kind of bring to each project is based on the kind of little bits of research that you manage to find time to do. And I'll be honest, it's often the sum total of the research wouldn't quite fit on the back of a cigarette packet. But you do your best. You try and kind of enrich your own understanding of the subject with your own research, and that's going on at the moment because my episodes of Versailles begin. It's not a spoiler. We sort of start to look at the persecution of the Protestants in the time of Louis XIV. So I think that's the one big difference. You've got history, really, and that is what I think. When you start a project or when you're asked to do something, what you need, I think there's two things which are really probably just two sides of the same coin. You need to establish a world, and also you need to find a way in. And I think that that sort of historical research and that sort of that resource, to have that material there and to know that these in the timeline of your story, in what was happening in history around the edges of your script are these things, and you can go away and read about them. And I sort of always find that really, really reassuring, because it just gives you another sort of another way of sort of gaining traction on the story. Grant mentioned a Ridley Scott film from the 70s called The Duelists, which is 1800. It's the set right at the beginning of the 19th century, but that film has always that's always been a kind of landmark for me. Nothing to do with the time of Louis XIV, but I felt that what it did, and maybe Ed's just thinking, oh well, it's something to do with France and it's in the past. Maybe it's as glib as that, but I think that what Ridley Scott did with that film is that he did what I'm always sort of desperate to find the formula for, which is he found a way of creating the past and making an entirely convincing rendition of that time and that place, so that when you watch that film, personally, I don't think you ever find yourself popping out the story. I think you're just absolutely immersed. And another film, Ridicule, again, a really good example. Set at Versailles in the time of Louis XVI. But yeah, so I think that in terms of what we do, I guess a sort of a first base requirement of what we do is to have sort of real cine literacy. Wait till Grant speaks later, because there is a man with an incredible sort of understanding and grasp of cinema history. But I think that's your sort of starting point. So yeah, and that is that, and I think, and again, in terms of making that world, that's where you have to begin.
As a historian coming in and starting as an advisor, I thought actually everyone's just interested in the history, that I should provide all the source materials and things like that. And I do that, but actually I've become more alert to the fact that, of course, productions use so many different points of reference. And I was working on a film recently, and we had a shared Dropbox folder, and I could see what the director was putting in as his visual references. And it was all of these kind of cinematic references from completely different historical periods, that was about different ways of storytelling. And that was a real eye-opener for me for thinking about how I then present history to those sorts of productions. How can I engage in those snapshots of stories in the same way and, kind of present the material in a way that's helpful to a production. But
Just to go on from that, I mean, one of the things, and I'm very open to suggestions. I mean, one of the things that's sort of really kind of vexing me is exactly that of I guess put simply, what was it like to be Louis XIV, and because obviously I'm going to have to direct George in a few weeks' time, and he's doing a brilliant job with what he's doing, but you always feel like you're the director, for God's sake, you've got to contribute something or come up with a few sort of thoughts. And I think in going back to what Hannah was saying, that's where, that's why, you're constantly sort of trying to sort of research through cinema to find other points of reference that might be sort of relevant, or might give you, might cast some light on what you're trying to achieve. If you're sort of immersed in a period and obviously you're writing so you can write, then I think the one thing that you want to see, the one thing that you want to see more than anything is passion. Very easy to say, but that you can read a document about any subject you like, and if it's not written with passion and that sort of, that kind of, it's good, I've got to do this, it's got to be out there, then it's not going to butter any parsnips. It's not going to get past first base. I think in terms of kind of pitching, in terms of articulating your idea, I think there's no better test than just doing and I'm sure you've done it, just the simple one page of A4, and also when all those sort of things like there's this what was that, the great Hollywood one-liner, and the pitch to it was Danny DeVito and Arnold Schwarzenegger are twins, and just the improbability of that is it's irresistible. Everyone wanted to go further with that, and it's finding that way of, I think just being quite hard-nosed and very, very commercial about it, and I think a healthy dollop of cynicism also helps, in terms of how am I going to stop people, because they will be, people will be shown these documents, every day, and they'll be looking at loads, and you go into important people's offices, and their rooms are just, you'd hate to think what would happen if a match was, set off in there, because there's so many scripts everywhere. So I think that's, I don't feel like I'm kind of quite getting to the kind of core of it, but I think make sure that passion is there, make sure that you can, and I think talking to people in the pub about your idea and just telling the story, I think every time you do that, and either people will be polite, but when it's really compelling, then people will sit up and listen. All those kind of questions that you get on all those kind of storytelling courses about, where do you want to leave the audience at the end of it? What do you want the audience to go out of the cinema thinking, or what, when they finish watching the program on where do you want your audience to be? What do you want them to be thinking about? I think all those questions, trying to sort of, kind of look at your idea as critically as you can from as many different sort of angles and perspectives, and keep on sort of pulling it apart and interrogating it, and also just be really, really upfront and write to agents and find ways of getting it to influential people. That's a really good question, and it's a very difficult one. It really varies. I think that when we kicked off Poldark, I was in very, very early on, and
well, we met in the British Library.
We met in the British Library. That's right. Yeah. And I think that it was still the scripts. I think by the time I came on board, they were probably sort of third or fourth draft. But there was still a desire to kind of, do lots more work on character, because I think Debbie's scripts were very, very faithful to the original novels, and looking back to the 70s series, they were kind of, there were characters that were there but weren't properly fleshed out. So I think there's, that's a really good example of where you can get sort of quite heavily involved in it. And again on Versailles at the moment, you know, there seems to be, there's a wonderfully sort of, I'll probably, you know, if you saw me in 4 weeks' time, it'd probably be a completely different story. But at the moment, there's a sort of fantastic sort of collaborative atmosphere, and, you know, we're kind of discussing, you know, the possibilities for the last script in the sort of run of episodes I'm doing, and it feels like, you know, there's you know, they're very, very open to ideas. There will be other times when, you know, that's not the case, you know, where, and also there'll be times when you kind of look at a script and you just think, yeah, well, you know, I did something called A Mother's Son about 5 years ago, written by a guy called Chris Lang, who's gone on to write the Unforgotten series, contemporary piece. I just read that and I thought, yeah, I know exactly how I'm going to shoot that. And I always, you know, one of the bits of advice to directors is, when you first read a script, just read the script. Don't think about directing it. Just read it and see how it works as a story. You know. But in terms of isn't it all done, it's kind of, I think, you know, if everyone in the room was given the same script and you're all told to go away and direct it, each film would be different. You know, so everyone's interpretation is always going to be so different. I work in television, and, you know, my whole life has, well, you know, apart from the bit that Hannah mentioned, but my whole life has been in sort of relatively populist TV, and I think that, you know, especially in the last few years, you know, the desire for sort of longevity in an idea, in a series, you know, that's what people want more than anything. So I think the more potential for sort of multiple series from a concept or an idea, you know, then the more promising and the more people are going to be interested in an idea.
I think also from a consultancy point of view, it's slightly different, because with a series, and when there's a chance of multiple series, you need to think about the implications of what's going to happen. Actually, if you get something slightly off for the purposes of narrative in a series, then you're going to have to replicate that in another series. So actually, if you've got lots of 8-part series and you might be running to 3 sets of them, then actually a little jig of history in one end can suddenly have a very big implication at the other end. Whereas in a film, you know, you're within this set narrative structure. So, you know, going to 2 hours on the screen. So fiddling around a little bit with a chronology here and a chronology there doesn't feel quite so stressful. Whereas actually on a television drama, sometimes it can feel more stressful because you don't know what the ramifications are going to be the next year in the next series of having made something that was in 1796 and 1800 or whatever, you know, that kind of playing with the narrative.
Each project brings its own sort of questions and its own challenges, but I think in terms of what we do, we sort of, you know, live and work in a commercial world, so that kind of informs that informs all the choices, you know, from kind of story through casting, all the way through, and I also think that. You know, that unfortunately, I think that's where the kind of hand of conservatism comes in, you know, at times, and you know, the brave choice is sometimes the one that has to be, you know, sort of passed on, because, you know, you want to be, you know, you really want everything to be bold, you really want everything to be brave, but then you find that people get a bit twitchy and a bit sort of a bit scared. But I think, you know, again, I'm sort of teeing Grant up beautifully, but, you know, I think Peaky Blinders is a really fantastic example of where people took really brave, really bold choices, and then suddenly they've got a franchise on their hands. The bold choice, you know, when it's allowed time to sort of blossom and flower, is you know, is often, you know, a really sort of, it turns out to be, you know, sort of counterintuitively a really good commercial choice as well. But I think, yeah, money, you know, money and time, you know, are the two things that we sort of we sort of have to answer to all the time.
I mean, to the historians watching with interest, it seems to us that there is a real boom of period dramas at the moment, but it could just be that there's a boom of dramas and we just kind of fixate on the ones that are set in the past. But would that be your view from the kind of production side of things, there seems to be lots of big series being commissioned and lots of money behind them, like The Crown. Had Victoria and ITV last year. People seem to be pitching things all the time. But is it just that it's a great time for television making, or is there a particular interest in the past at the moment that seems to be tapping into a kind of audience sense of what they want to look at or how they want to spend their time?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think everyone knows that there's a sort of thirst for content because there's a sort of so many more platforms. The Netflix example or the Amazon model. Everyone's kind of tapped into those platforms now, and I think the Crown is a really interesting example where it's interesting because I talk to a lot of people that couldn't really be doing with it because it's just another sort of period drama. It's about Elizabeth II, and 10 hours of my life, do I really need to waste it? But I watched it and I thought it was the best thing I've watched for years. And I think they'd made bold choices. They'd invested heavily. And I personally, you can argue the toss, but I think it's a sort of I'm really surprised they were allowed to get away with it as well, because I think it's a brilliant, subtly subversive piece of storytelling, and I think it's sort of really, really, really good. But in terms of the sort of the sheer sort of volume of period pieces and period drama, I think I think there's that's something that you'd really have to ask the commissioners and the execs. I think that there's a when something like, for example, when I'd done Poldark, obviously when I was next free, then you get scripts for lots of other things that are a bit like Poldark. I guess wigs in Poldark was a really good example, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And to have all the main characters not wigged was completely wrong, wasn't it? Pretty much.
So choices, these are choices. Choices that
historically inaccurate.
The choices.
So, Hannah.
So my rule of thumb is that a production should be able to make choices, not mistakes. That there should be enough information available to production to know when they are doing something wrong for narrative purposes or for budget purposes or for constructions of character or whatever. And one of the things that I've become very attuned to as a consultant is that things have to work visually immediately, and those choices can be taken for lots of reasons, not necessarily with history. And you need characters to work visually. So you need people to have different kinds of hair sometimes so that your lead characters look different. They have different kinds of clothing so that visually it works as a narrative as well. And those sorts of elements mean that choices are made to get good results for narrative and visual effect. That might mean that we can't always be completely faithful to the most precise kind of understanding of the past. Grant's frowning at me because he's a very keen history buff, so you can correct me later, Grant, but that would be my political answer.
I also think that when we sort of started Poldark, I don't know, just this kind of never underestimate the effect a costume has on somebody. And whenever somebody dresses, whenever an actor or an actress is put in period costume and they're wigged, their stance changes. The corset is going to change their performance. Their shoes will be really uncomfortable. They'll be thinking about their shoes, and they won't be, 100% in character. And I think when you want to get closer to characters, because characters really, if you can't relate to characters, then you're not going to engage in, or it's making it harder to engage in the story. I think all those little, any of those little sort of awkward things or impediments, okay, so if you took that to its extreme, you'd have something that's set in the 18th century, it'd be like a sort of Shakespeare set in the 18th century, but in modern day clothing, and I know that wouldn't work either. But I think it's legitimate to you have to make those choices, and some of them are historically inaccurate. But I think what you're always trying to do is you're always trying to foreground the story. And I know that if everybody had been wigged in Poldark, I think the performances would have changed.
And we can revisit this one with Grant as well later, because I know he feels very strong about this. And actually, Grant's production design is, I have to say, is different to a lot of the others, and it's so perfectly, beautifully realised with so much rich detail and executed with such knowledge of history. So when Grant's talking about this, it's not like talking about to another production designer later. But I think we can revisit some of those ideas about those kind of choices.
But those debates become about practicalities as well, because you can have really very, very heated debates. What do you call them, arguments? I don't know.
Discussions.
In production meetings about how dirty you want to go, because
it costs money.
Costs money to go and wash them.
Yeah.
But I think it's really simple. I think if anything, my rule of thumb is if anything detracts from the story, then you have to sort of think really critically and carefully about, has the right choice been made?
Well, I think it's about a combination of things, and I think that I think quite carefully about my role as a consultant, and I try and deliver as much historical information as I can based on the expert knowledge that I have, but I'm aware of the fact that the decisions that are made are not necessarily mine, and that actually the best way to work with the production is to understand what it is that they want and try and help achieve the best possible results based within those parameters. But I will always say when I think something is fundamentally wrong and be quite clear about that. But I try not to write to the Telegraph about it or have a big huff and then ruin any conversations that we might have. I mean, I try and create conversations with, people that I work with, and whether or not that's successful is for other people to decide, but that is my way of approaching things, and I think that's something that I've tried to develop over the years. So whereas the first production I went on, I was like, oh gosh, this isn't what I thought it would be at all. Actually, now I've sort of been like, well, that's an interesting interpretation of things, but maybe we could add these things in as well, or this is actually wrong, and also to make suggestions. So it's not just about identifying problems, because that's not always that helpful for production, just to say, well, this is wrong. Actually, they need to know, well, what can we do that would make it right for you, but also right for us within the parameters that we're working in. And it's about that problem solving that I've become quite interested in. So that's why I'm much less now, oh, I hate this, I can't bear this, how can you possibly do this to the story? It's much more about, well, how can I try and decant what's in my head in a way that's helpful?
Currently, I'd go back to the Crown. I just thought in terms of, I wouldn't single out any one moment. I think there were lots of great episodes, but I just thought their approach and their kind of what they were trying to do.
But what about their approach made it bold and innovative for you? Was it the way it was shot, the way the
No. Just simply the writing, and the fact that they wanted to. I think they wanted to. It felt to me like they were making a series about a living monarch that I could. I feel like that would be a way that's been done with people that have been a long time dead. But I think to do that with a living monarch and to sort of, and I think in a very kind of gentle way to sort of, to try and show lots of different sides of the story and to imply things, and maybe that just appeals to my sort of salacious nature, but I think to include all those things in the story about the guy that she was really close friends with that really looks like Prince Andrew and things like that. For me, I thought that was exciting and that was challenging, I think. So yeah, that would be, maybe it's not the most obvious, but that's the first one, recently that sort of really comes to mind. Just going back to what you're talking about before, I think it's really important to remember that, and again, I guess it sort of sounds a little bit defensive, but these are all representations, and I think that that's. And I think that, in terms of, going back to, and those stylistic choices are changing constantly. You know, I think one of the great things about the bold innovation of Peaky Blinders was that it really foregrounded again the role of the director in TV drama, and you know, really it's primarily TV drama is a writer and producer's medium. What Peaky Blinders did was it just, you know, it put the director right back in the forefront of that, you know, creative process. You know, conversely, 2 or 3 years later, The Crown, I think it's, you know, the sort of visual style and the directorial approach of The Crown is to render, you know, it's to render the role of the director as invisible as possible, you know. And again, I think that's absolutely tonally in line with the story, because you know they talk, you know, in through the series they talked a lot about, you know, not wanting to exaggerate things, not wanting to do things for effect. I'm sorry, there was a sort of key word which I can't remember at the moment, but you know, it was in terms of things being individual, and individuality was really frowned on. That was it. And I think that tonally, you know, in support of the story, the individuality of the directorial choices were, I think they were sort of sublimated.
The things that I wouldn't claim responsibility for anything that's bold and innovative in a drama, but I am interested in an academic way about how history is sometimes presented, and interested in particularly in how what an audience sees and then what I might see as a historian. And so if we take a film like The Duchess, on the face of it, it might seem to be a kind of classic period drama. It's got big stars in it, it's filmed in National Trust country houses, etc., etc. But it has a marital rape, and it has, you know, female masturbation in it, which are not necessarily tropes that you might typically regard with that kind of period drama, but actually tells a much more compelling story about certain facets of 18th century life that otherwise wouldn't have made it onto screen. So although an audience might think that they're just modern conceits in order to create dramatic effect, I would see them as actually useful interpretations of the past. And I'm interested in how Poldark is received by an audience, because, you know, that's on the face of it kind of classic Sunday night period drama. We get a lot of press profiling of the lead cast. But the novels, and actually some of the storylines, you know, the first novels were written in the 1940s, and they're actually a very rich social history of working class life, what historians would now describe as a history from below, which we associate with the 1960s social history writing by historians like E.P. Thompson. But actually it was being written in a novel first by Winston Graham. And so, you know, there's an alternative interpretation of the 18th century that's embedded in those Poldark stories. It's actually often missed in the way in which the press receives it or an audience receives it, which focuses on other details completely. So I'm kind of interested in those elements.
The very first question that we ask Grant is how he gets to have such a cool job, and to give a bit of advice about the trajectory that's taken him in this direction, and any of you contemplating the same sort of career, what some tips might be. Right. How do you become a groovy production designer?
Well, I suppose I started by I was caught by film and television. You know, when I was growing up, watching film on the television was something I got really drawn into, and I mean watching certain particular films. And then I was taken to the cinema and I saw particular films like Cromwell. And I remember that which is odd, Richard Harris playing Cromwell. Interesting. And they kind of filled my imagination, really. And from there on in, I remember being taken to Pinewood Studios. And I remember going into the 007 stage, and was just like the scale of it was just extraordinary. And I think coupled with sort of also adoring kind of movies, I was gone. I wanted to do that from day very, very early on. And I then studied. I went to art college, and I did a degree in theatre design, because there wasn't any film design courses at that period. But I didn't really have any intention of doing theatre. So most of my designs look like film sets or that kind of look. And I got offered a holiday relief design assistant's job on my graduation, which is where Ridley Scott and Tony Scott and all the people started. They all started as what they called a holiday relief design, which they don't have. It's defunct. They don't have it anymore. And that's really where I began. I just kept going, kept doing, kept working.
So you've just hinted that this world has changed quite a bit since your kind of initial entry into this world, in terms of giving us some tips who might want to be you.
Well, the tips
what would one do now?
Well, what I would do is, it's changed in the context of there's no holiday relief, but what you would try and do is get to be a runner in an art department. Not in the production, in the art department, because that's where you'll learn to be within the context of of production design and art direction. And that's where you'd go. You'd be a runner. And you work your way up, because you'll see all the different craft elements that are involved within an art department, from the set decoration, because within bigger productions there will be the set decoration department and the art directing. They're two vastly different disciplines within the department, because one is dealing with the dressing of the sets and the other is dealing with the actual physical making of the sets and changing locations, etc., etc. That's what I would advise anyone wanting to get into production design. If that's what they really want to do, is be passionate about production design, find out what that actually really is, and then head to get a list of the designers that you admire, try to approach them. The really good ones will always be approachable. I know I've always given people a couple of weeks' work experience to see whether they like it or not, because it is actually, it's an intensive environment that you're working in. It's not 9 to 5, it's very committed. It's like you go into a parallel universe, really. There, is that good?
That just about covers it, yes.
Okay, so, good.
So one of the examples of academic engagement between the university and something that you've been doing recently is through the St Stephen's project that we've been running on the Palace of Westminster, and we kind of gave our digital models of the Palace of Westminster to you. Could you explain a little bit about what you then did with those models in order to make them useful for a production design and for the CG, for the
I wanted to
VFX company,
because
and
most of
so how academic research kind of translates into something that people might see at 9:30 on BBC One.
Yeah, well, you will see it, but it'd be so weirdly, it's like everything. You do so much research, and a lot of stuff you don't see, and it will get cut. But there'll be like seconds where you see the thing you've... And in this case, it's the city of it's Westminster. And it doesn't really per se exist now as it did in the 1605. And what I wanted to do was have that world reasonably historically accurate. I wasn't interested in it being not accurate. And that's just me. But there is one scene where Catesby, there's no spoilers here, we do know what happened in the gunpowder plot, is there? The thing is that he suddenly comes up with the plot, the idea of what he's going to do. He's going to kill the king. And he looks out through a window of his kind of safe house. And he looks out onto Westminster and he sees the Parliament. He sees the building, and that is going to be digitally created. The actual is put behind. We built the set, but then beyond the windows would be a green screen, and digitally we're going to drop in the city of Westminster, and that's all you're going to see. But I wanted it to be exact, so I came along. I got the reference, and I basically drew all of that out physically by hand, and then supplied it to this computer-generated, the CGI company that will then render it and put it in there. Whether that survives intact into the final cut, that's out of my remit, but that's basically what we did. I think you can create a much more stronger visual look to something if you're creating it physically. You have much more control over the look, the colours. Because if you go to a National Trust property, for example, within gunpowder, the references that you're very restrictive of what you can do physically, and you can't paint ceilings, even though they did have painted ceilings. A lot of we see these panels. Yeah, they're very nice, but they wouldn't have been quite like that. They would have been painted. You can't control. This is it. You can dress it. You can semi-make it look something better. But when you build from the ground up, you've got complete control. And that's where on bigger pictures you build a lot more because you can control. You can control the lighting. For example, the staging. For example, where you put a door, where you put a window, is dictating where the light's going to come and where an entrance will be. You can build steps up, so you have more dominant entrances. So with sets, you can begin to choreograph action. Within the context of To Walk Invisible, the choice was to make it as, we wanted it to be as accurate as we possibly could, down to the fact that I wanted Flossie and I wanted Keeper to be correct. That there had to be a span. Because if you watch the 1970s, late 70s, the Brontes of Haworth, which was with Michael Kitchen and all the rest of it. I mean, the house it was shot on the original with the Wade extension and all the rest of it. And it's wrong. Or if you look at the 19 kind of late 1980s, early 1990s French version of the Bronte sisters, with the wonderful Elizabeth or Ajani in it, and she doesn't look anything like Emily. But that we wanted very much. I know that Sally and I sat and we did talk about it. It's got to be. We wanted it to have a reality. We wanted to feel that it was a real house, a living family house, and that it would have a sense of a family living in it, and that authenticity is what we were trying to go for. Whereas when you talk about authenticity within something like the Crimson Petal and the White, I was more interested in it being more a kind of reference to Dario Argento kind of feel, and that influenced the look of that more than it being critically kind of historically accurate, because I wanted it to be color-coded, and very, very specifically color-coded, so that there were white sets and there were red sets, there were crimson sets, and they helped tell you a story. So that's very clear in my mind what I was doing, which then I remember there was a conversation. Did he plan that? Yeah, I did. But that's authenticity is flexible. Is a flexible medium. But sort of like, for example, that with Crimson, I did want the Mrs. Castaways to be squalid, because that has to be. You have to understand why she wants to escape that world and go from essentially a life of bondage to what she thinks is freedom. But actually what she ends up is just in another cage. Rackham puts her in the smallest room in the biggest house. Does that answer any questions?
Just in terms of authenticity,
no.
It's odd because one of the more interesting, authentic historical experiences I've had recently is stepping into your set of an early 17th century room and actually feeling like my word, you really have stepped into the past. This is just uncanny. It's a very odd experience. And yet it's all constructed on an industrial lot in Bradford or Keighley.
Yeah. I mean,
and I found that as a historian, I found that very unsettling. But at some level, it was a more authentic historical experience than going into a National Trust house where somebody tries to sell me a tea towel. So it's just, what you're doing is very interesting in terms of authenticity.
Well, it's interesting because the parsonage now, they've got the room, Bramwell's room, that we've reproduced with Simon Armitage to recreate his room, which is basically, as far as I was concerned, the leap was that he's a teenager still, and he's a messy teenager. So I don't know, the authenticity, it can be something very minute, that you try to think, if you put yourself into that character. As far as I'm concerned, when I read, I try to become the character, to design the room. For example, if it was Cecil's, is that Cecil, I'm kind of Cecil, what would Cecil be about? Cecil's about power, it's about patrician power. And this is his world. This is the only world that he feels safe in. The rest outside of that, when he's in court, he's going to be in a very fluid, politically dangerous environment. But when he's actually in his hub, his war room, he's basically the dominant force. So hence, how do you explain that? How do you make that? How do you get that across to an audience very quickly? So that was the thing, that he had it in gold. He reflected his power, his prestige, his money. I'll have the biggest room. I'll paint it all in gold. And then I'm going to also push the element, the element of that he defends the state by having motifs put into the panel, which was the St. George flag. Very subtle, but they're all there, and the rose and all the rest of it. So you play with it. That's how you kind of like. That's how I approach it. I think if you're not confident with the history you've got, the story you've got, then you end up doing devices like, for example, exposition and what we call rollers of information coming up. The year 18, this is the time of the whatever. And Napoleon was going to invade Russia and Well, actually, I think you should just be really confident. They should be really confident within the story that you're trying to tell. I think all of that starts to bogs it down into being a kind of pseudo-history lesson. And I don't think I personally think that's where a weakness is shown in a story, in a period piece. For example, you don't find that within Barry Lyndon. You're straight into the story. In The Leopard, there's no indication of where you just end up in the Sicilian aristocracy. And I've just named what I think are two probably the greatest period movies, because they allow you to accept the story within its own within its own context, within its own world. I mean, I've just done a film which comes out in September, which is based on the Peter Ackroyd, Dan Leno and the Limehouse Golem, which is kind of really a kind of revisionist Victorian, a bit like The Crimson, which are kind of postmodernist takes on the Victorian novel. So Ackroyd's novel, Dan Leno and the Limehouse Golem, is a kind of, to my mind, a kind of postmodernist take on sort of Jack the Ripper, with a lot of gender politics thrown into it. And I found that fascinating. So you want to embrace, sort of a lot of different variety of influence into that. So you don't make it bland. Like, for example, it's a musical. So when you start reading about musicals, which is really fascinating, we started the premise of how are we going to do this musical, Dan Leno's musical. And you go, okay, you think logically, you think, okay, what is it? What is it? You do your research. So I think there was about 60, 70 actual musicals in London in the 1890s. I'm not talking theatres, I'm talking physical musicals. And then we started thinking, okay, they aren't all theatres, because they weren't. When you start doing research, you find out they were in shops. They were in converted pubs. They were like pop-up, pop-up restaurants. They were essentially something like that. But what's more interesting is the fact that actually they were like cinemas for the poor. They were showing they would start midday in their performances, go midday, there would be a lunch, and then there would be an afternoon, and then there would be an early evening. There were about 5 performances a day, but they were coining it in. The owners who ran them were making huge fortunes off the artists that were performing, which were paid very little. So when you start knowing that information, that releases, wait a minute, I don't need to look for a theatre. I can set it somewhere else. I can start thinking about how to actually make it look different. And then you do the fact when you start reading the script, which is very key, Because all the answers are in the script, if you really look hard. That's what, some very fine actor told me that. All the answers are in the script, right? Yeah, okay. And he's a brilliant actor as well. But what's really interesting is that sort of you start to realise that the main character, her life has changed by coming into the theatre. It's a world away from where she once was. So how do you get that also across to an audience? How do you accentuate that? You use colour, you use shape, you use the size of the space. So that's how you come across. That's how you design. And that's not about trying to shortchange an audience's perception. In a way, you want to also show them something they've never seen before, because otherwise you end up regurgitating everything in itself. No, I don't. I couldn't do what you do. I really couldn't. I've got utter respect for historians, really, I find them fascinating. You as a group, a body of people, trying to make people understand their own past, it helps us in some way make sense of who we are. We're always trying to make sense of who we are as human beings. It's not some, and as far as kind of economics and looking at there's always way. I always find that's fascinating because economics gives you information about how people physically lived, and if they're living, then that gives you a sense of how they lived. And that informs your choices of what's in a room, what's not in a room, the size of the room, who would be living there, all those. So that's how that informs that. That's really fascinating. Because there's like, I remember I read a book, it was City of Laughter? Yeah. It was really interesting when I was doing Crimson. Because what was really interesting was about kind of like the socioeconomic kind of makeup of prostitution, which was fundamentally one of the cores of Crimson's about. It's about economics. It's about transfer of sort of rack and buy sex with sugar. But Sugar is writing about it, and it's fascinating. But that led me to realise that there was. You had to show how these women actually physically lived, and it isn't pretty. It's like the tools of their trade. They had to be on show. You had to understand what they would do, and this is something you have conversations with, and you want to portray that, and you need to show that, because otherwise it becomes sanitized. And that's the worst thing you can do. That's an insult to all our intelligences. Sanitizing history. I'm very against that. I don't think we should sanitize it and make it neat and tidy, because it isn't. History isn't tidy. I think film now, and about watching box sets and stuff, is that you can treat really great movies or great box sets like texts, because a lot of people have actually put a lot of thought into it. And I was talking about kind of like, for example, something like the historical record of the gunfight at the OK Corral. If you go back, I know you're going to go, what's he on about? But if you, as an exercise, wanted to take 5 films, starting with John Ford's seminal My Darling Clementine, you then went to the super Panavision 75mm epic that is John Sturges' The Gunfight at the OK Corral with Kirk Douglas and Burt Lancaster. And then you go to the cynical and very hard-edged, I suppose quite melancholic version that John Sturges made next, which was called Hour of the Gun. And then you went to Lawrence Kasdan's Wyatt Earp with Kevin Costner, and then George P. Cosmos' Tombstone. What have you got? You've got the same event relensed several times through actually nearly half a century.
So as well as it being fascinating, if you were to kind of turn that into a history essay argument, and you wanted to write your MA thesis based on that argument of looking at the depiction of this character, multiply depicted across a period of 40 or 50 years, what sorts of historical questions of causation or importance would you attribute to that? I mean, clearly it's fascinating and clearly it's interesting. I mean, it was the kind of poldark question I wanted to ask this in the first session, which is, what does the difference between the 1970s depiction of poldark and the current depiction of poldark tell us?
Oh, I think it tells you a lot
about contemporary culture and society, other than the fact that if you look at the original series, that they do actually look quite 1970s in terms of, sideburns and lots of hair. But there must be more to it.
But there's a really interesting book about costume design, about through the period, and it's the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and it debates this. It debates the whole the way in which costume reflects really the period in which the movie was made. For example, if you took Bonnie and Clyde, late 60s, it has an influence, the look of the 1960s on 1920s costume. So if you took that as a reference, it's the same with production design, and it's the same with camera moves and preoccupations of that period that the film is being made in. So, for example, the kind of counterculture of the 70s is reflected in movies like Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, which, or for example, Far From the Madding Crowd is a reflection of really the 60s liberation in the arts in Britain, which is John Schlesinger's doing, which if you look at now the Carey Mulligan version, it's a kind of, it's a different take. There's a different emphasis on Bathsheba's character.
Can we end with a quick round of applause for our speakers, please?
Thank you.